I don't have the PowerPoint tonight. This is one. This is one of those few presentations where I don't have a PowerPoint. I am going to talk on the microphone. I usually don't do that, but there's a huge crowd here. I'm only embarrassed because after hearing Louise talk on this microphone, oh my God, I fell in love with you just all over. It was just, what a voice, huh? Wasn't she great? So, I'm just totally floored by how many of you are here and how many people said they actually came to hear me. I find that hard to believe. And then there's some guy here filming me. And everybody's always telling, oh, I saw you on YouTube. Really? I didn't know I filmed anything. So I guess there's going to be another one maybe on YouTube here. I don't know. But tonight's topic is True Confessions, the Mistakes I've Made. It's a 4-day seminar. Let's talk about the underlying causes. What are the things that lead us to making mistakes? Any thoughts? I hate to be the only one talking. What are your thoughts about what leads us to making mistakes? Any ideas?
Fatigue.
Fatigue, certainly, absolutely. That's why I made a mistake of coming here. I was tired and I needed to get something. No. Did I hear something back here?
Yes, I said speed. You're going too
Speed.
Fast. You're going too fast.
Oh. Going too fast, absolutely. Being in a hurry, yes, absolutely.
Right.
Have you guys been reading my notes here? What's up? Yes, complacency can really bite us big time in the butt. Absolutely. Forgetfulness, yep. Distractions.
Improper pre-flighting.
Improper pre-flighting.
Same as complacency.
Yes and no, or perhaps being in a hurry. But it certainly can lead to some problems. I'll talk about one of them that I had. Get there-itis. Absolutely. Any other thoughts?
Pride.
Pride. What are all the rest of you going to think about me after, are you going to come fly with me again after you hear all the stuff I'm going to talk about tonight? I might be out of business. Yeah, pride is a big one. If we wanted to come up with a term under which we could lump all of these, a bucket, so to speak, that we could put all of these into, what would that bucket be called?
Judgment.
Human factors, absolutely. Airplanes themselves don't make mistakes. Sometimes I think some airplanes are sentient beings, have a mind of their own, have thoughts, have feelings. Some of them have certainly spoken back to me. Airplanes don't make mistakes. Pilots do. Okay? And we've covered almost all of them. The only thing I might add in this one that I would certainly include are those hazardous attitudes. Those 5 hazardous attitudes: macho, anti-authority, resignation, impulsivity, and invulnerability. And I think every one of us perhaps has all 5 of those residing within ourselves. I know I do. And we have to be very careful in managing those hazardous attitudes and keeping them under control. Have you ever had your GPS fail? Okay, a few not yet. Okay, a few have had them fail. I would highly recommend that periodically you go out and file slant uniform. Because whether it's the equipment that fails, a truck driver who's bought a GPS jammer for $35 on eBay so he can pull his truck over on the side of the road and go to sleep and his boss won't know it. And I'm not making this up because it has happened. Or there are folks who don't like us and it isn't all that hard to jam GPS. I'm surprised it hasn't happened yet. But when all the GPS goes down and you're up there in the clag, if you don't remember how to fly using VORs, using cross radials, you might be in a very big bit of a bind. I personally, people who come to train with me, if they've got a slant golf airplane, I can guarantee you part of their IPC will entail flying slant uniform. Don't wait for someone like me to mandate it. Mandate it for yourself and practice. Because the day will come when you're going to have to use it. So, have you ever had the weather go down on you unexpectedly? I see a lot of heads nodding. I think every one of us has had that happen, okay? Is there any way, as pilots, that we could tell that the weather's going down. So here it is, a beautiful day, okay? And you take off to go somewhere, and if you've just done that VFR, direct to, so it's KFIT to wherever it's gonna be, KORL, we're going to Orlando, whatever it might be, it's gonna go perfectly straight. It's gonna take you right there, okay? The forecast is for super clear skies. The forecast also was for your destination, that there would be a cold front approaching your destination. It wouldn't get there until later in the afternoon, and about 2 hours after your proposed arrival time, the forecast would be for a chance of thunderstorms. Slight chance, TSRA. So you take off, you level off, you complete your cruise checks, everything's fine, you know, you've done everything. Yeah, I remember to pick the gear up, but yada, 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 it's all done. What would tell you that perhaps that forecast is wrong?
Flight watch.
Flight watch? No. You wouldn't even have to call flight watch. You look out the window, okay, you look out the window and it's severe clear. It's just like the forecast. Severe clear. No clouds till I get to my destination. 2 hours later, there's going to be a squall line coming through.
The predicted bearing or ground speed are not what you...
Okay, ground speed and
bearing or heading.
bearing or really heading, because our bearing is bearing from where you are to wherever you're going. GPS, we use the terms now, desired track, DTK, which is certainly what I use. And if you've done your planning, you know what heading should track your desired track. If you've done your planning, you know what your ground speed should be. If you've looked at your winds aloft, you know what the temperature should be. If any of those are not what you planned, did you plan? Quite possibly the forecast is off. Now, it might mean that you'll run out of gas before you get there. That's a typical reaction. People, oh, well, I probably won't have a gas. Well, maybe you're going to get there much faster. But maybe the thunderstorms are going to get there much faster, too. The fact of the matter is that the winds aloft are not what were forecast. How many of you use ForeFlight and are able to access the MOS, Model Output Statistics, or anybody using those now as part of your briefing? I am. In fact, I was on a webinar last night, tips for getting a better self-briefing. And I asked the lady who put it on, could you explain, please, the difference between an MOS and a TAF? She didn't know what I was talking about, MOS. So I didn't find out my answer to that one. But have you ever noticed that sometimes the MOS and the TAF do not necessarily agree with each other? Okay? You know, and I see that quite often. I've found that quite often I lead more towards the MOS than the actual TAF. The fact of the matter is, if you're up there flying, and you haven't done your planning, and you're going VFR, GPS direct, go perfectly straight, you don't know what your speed should be, you don't know what your heading should be, my airplane's right on the magenta line, I must be doing something right. How do you know if the weather's going south? The weather's going south. How many of you are flying with what we call WITIC, weather in the cockpit? Whether it's ADS-B, XM, no one? A lot of hands going up again. I'm sure many of the IFR pilots are. Whether you're getting it on your GPS or on your iPad, there's a lot of wonderful weather product that we can access in the cockpit that we didn't have even 10 years ago, okay? So whether it's getting into that stuff or calling up flight service, you all know we can't call Flight Watch anymore, right? Right, well, Flight Watch is gone. However, flight service personnel are trained now, have been trained to answer the types of questions we would get from Flight Watch. Give them a holler. Give them a PIREP. Let them know so that they can pass it on to the meteorologist that the winds aloft are not what were forecast, which means the whole forecast is not correct. Give them that, and then find out. Have the TAFs changed since I took off? Okay. I've developed a way, though, for those of you who do fly IFR and have to deal with getting clearances where you have to call over the phone and you're going to get a rush to meet a void time. I've got a way to not have to rush. I can take my time. I can always drain my sumps last thing before the flight, and I don't have to run out to the airplane, rush to misspell all these different waypoints along an extensive route. I call if I have the number for the TRACON, and sometimes it's a little tricky to figure those out, but once you have them, you call the TRACON directly on your cell phone, and you ask for your clearance with a hold for release. Read back the clearance with a hold for release. Now you can take your time, drain your sumps, go to the airplane, start it up, do your taxi checks, get your flight plan in either before you taxi or after you stop taxiing. Remember, don't try to put that flight route in your GPS while you're taxiing. Guaranteed, you'll take out a taxi light, and that means an engine teardown.
Clarify, hold for, what did you say that term was?
Hold for release is the term. No time at all. It means you're not released, hold for it. And in fact, if you call flight service quite often, if you've got a call, as an example, on my New England trips, I end up in Berlin, New Hampshire, and you've got to get your clearance through an RCO, and even in the RCO, they'll tell you hold for release, because the RCO is going to the Bangor Flight Service Station. Why does Flight Service Station say ATC clears? They're merely clearance delivery. They are not ATC. They don't have the authority to clear you. They're the messenger. And quite often they'll say hold for release, and then they'll finally come back and tell you that you're released. There's a whole bunch more with that, and it's a whole other seminar that I do with a lot of PowerPoints. But when you call for the hold for release, you can take your time, enter the things. It does entail that you'll have cell phone reception when you get to the threshold. Now you get out your cell phone, you call the TRACON, Cardinal 516 Alpha Pop, threshold runway 3, ready to go IFR to Oshkosh, and they come back, you're released, void time in 5 minutes. No rush.
So you're saying clearance delivery, you can't do that with clearance delivery?
You certainly could. You certainly could. If you can get clearance delivery, you know, as here, you have an RCO, and who does the RCO hook you up with here out of Fitchburg?
Bridgeport.
You're going to Bridgeport. Okay, so you're actually going to a flight service station. And quite typically, they usually will tell you hold for release. The other thing too, this goes along with my IFR seminar, and really, in a sense, it's a mistake that I see pilots make, is when they call a flight service station, they just say, oh, it's Cardinal 516 Alpha Pop, IFR 2. Sometimes they're just saying IFR. They don't even say where they're going to, or for that matter, where they are. So if you're here at Fitchburg and you're calling Bridgeport Radio to get a clearance, Bridgeport Radio, Cardinal 516 Alpha Pop, on the ground, get their attention first, Cardinal 516 Alpha Pop. They come back, 516 Alpha Pop, Bridgeport Radio, how can we help you? Another thing about being in a hurry, and somebody mentioned here, maybe it was Louise, about pre-flights. I hope I'm not the only one who was taken off with my cow plug still in. I hope I'm not the only one who's taken off with the pitot cover still on. I don't do much primary training anymore, but when I was working with pilots in training who were working on their private certificate, I actually insisted that we would fly with airspeed covered up and altimeter covered up through the pattern. So that if you do make that mistake of covering up your pitot tube, or perhaps your static source is blocked, you can still fly the airplane looking out the window. It's great practice. I'm not necessarily saying that you should go out there and do it by yourselves, but get an instructor. On your next flight review, say, hey, can I try this? Can I try going with my airspeed covered up and my altimeter covered up? Oh, we'll just do some pattern work and see how well you can fly the airplane. I'll bet you'll be surprised that you can do a pretty good job of it, okay? I don't think the next one many of you have done, but I did it. It wasn't my Super Cruiser. It was my first year of owning in it. I had to go get an annual. And unfortunately, they couldn't do it at Great Barrington, so I was going to go do it at Freehold, which is about 30 miles away, the other side of the Hudson River. And the fellow who was going to come pick me up, and I rented the Cherokee for him to come get me, was somewhat directionally challenged, shall we say. And so I knew that we'd have to kind of do a very loose formation for him to find Freehold. And I took off ahead of him and climbed up, and I was waiting for him, and he wasn't coming yet. I was in a hurry because I had to make this appointment with my mechanic. I said I'd be there by such a time, and I'm OCD and anal about being on time. You know, I was here 3 hours early today. It was just to save gas because I had to go to Boston, and this was on the way back. But I was in a hurry, and as I taxied my Super Cruiser out, I felt this kind of jerk just as I was going out past the tires, and I didn't think too much of it. No, I wonder what that was. I climbed up, okay, and now my friend who's gonna come pick me up is finally taxiing to take off, and I was up at 3,000 feet. I said, well, what's the fastest way to get back down 1,500 feet to join up with them and lead them to Freehold? I know. And I pulled the power back, and I pulled the stick back, and as it broke, I kicked left rudder and spun on down, and here we are, and away we went to Freehold. We landed at Freehold, and I taxied into my tie-down place, and I got out of the airplane. I was going to tie it down because it was going to be there a little while, and I walked over to the right wing, and there was a rope and a tire, and I pulled it up, and I put the rope through the ring, and I tied it down, and then I walked over to the other side, and there was a rope on the ground, and got that rope, and I tied the other wing, and I walked around to the tail of the aircraft. And, well, look at that. Someone's already got a rope on the tail wheel. I should be embarrassed about this. You know, that could have killed me if that rope had wrapped around in the spin and tied up, because the tail wheel is connected to the rudder through chains and springs. I might have lost my rudder completely. I might not have even been able to get out of the spin. Being in a hurry, being complacent, being proud, human factors. They can get you every time. How many of you talk about sterile cockpit? A few hands are going up, okay? Where do most of our mid-air collisions occur, folks? Around the airport, within about a 3 to 5 mile radius of the airport, or on the ground. And if you've got a motor mouth sitting beside you and you're trying to look for traffic, or you're trying to hear a common traffic advisor, somebody announcing where they are, and somebody yakety yak. So we certainly have to talk about sterile cockpit as part of our passenger briefing. Now, my last wife, God bless her, when we went flying, usually it was to Block Island. I'd say, hey, Annie, you want to go flying? Are we going to Block Island? Sure. Yeah, I'll go. Okay. She knew about my sterile cockpit rule. Coming back into Great Barrington, landing runway 11. How many of you know Great Barrington? How many of you have flown in there? How many of you have flown runway 11? Yeah, it's interesting, right? Yeah. There are a bunch of spruce trees that are slowly getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And of course, so many pilots make the mistake of watching the trees rather than the aim point. If you look at the aim point and the trees aren't coming between you and the aim point, there's no problem. But how many of you know the name Roderick Wojciechowski? Started IMC clubs. I taught him how to fly. And I remember he was Polish, okay, and he had literally escaped from Poland while he was still communist. He was one of Lech Walensa's lieutenants. And he would say to me, Doug, I can feel those spruce branches tickling my behind every time we come in. That was the kind of thing going into runway 11. Anyway, we're coming into runway 11. Now, of course, I've been on the beach all day long, sun, salt, doing a lot of body surfing, squinting, coming home into that western setting sun. They're using runway 11, turn my base, turn my final, I'm watching my aim point, and all of a sudden Annie says, Doug, what's that? And let me tell you, when someone says, what's that, and you're in an airplane, did they get your attention? What's what? The smoke. Smoke! This is a tube and fabric airplane. Where? And she said, over there. There was a sawmill. There still is a sawmill just to the north of the approach to runway 11. And it actually wasn't smoke. They were just releasing the sawdust out of their dust collector. There was this big cloud of dust. Let me tell you, that was the worst landing I have ever done in my life. You talk about a bounce. Put me at least 20 feet back up into the air. Things were very, very quiet as we taxied in. I must admit, the older I get, I have checklists for virtually every operation that I have. And I use them, and I use them religiously. So I think most people do. I do see sometimes a problem, and I love to create discussions. Just out of curiosity, just through a show of hands. How many of you use a checklist as what I would call a do list? In other words, you get that checklist out and you follow it step by step by step by step, and you do all the things. Okay, a lot of hands going up. How many of you use it as an actual checklist? In other words, you do a flow and then get out the list and check, oh, I missed that. How many of you would say it would depend on the condition?
Depends.
Yeah. And so for so many of the things that we do in aviation, the answer might very well be, well, it depends, okay? Certainly if you're learning a brand new airplane, it's got to become a do list because you just don't know the systems, you don't know the flows, things of that nature. Austin is out here somewhere, and I know Austin, you're part owner of this Cherokee 180 back there, so you know the airplane pretty well, and you probably don't need that checklist per se to do your checks. But I'd certainly encourage you to use it to check to make sure you didn't miss anything. And I'm not picking on you, I'm just because you had a nice airplane, it was right there. So.
Doug, do you want to comment on checklists for different phases of flight?
Absolutely. And what Mark said, do I want to comment on checklists for different phases of flight? I use them for virtually every phase, especially flying in the IFR scenario. So I've got my pre-start checklist. A lot of these, I will admit, I use as a flow. I do a flow, and then I get the checklist out to see what I've missed. I've got my run-up checklist. I've got my before takeoff checklist. I've got my climb checklist. Boy, that's an important one for the gear and flaps, and cowl flaps. Certainly your performance should tell you something's wrong, you know, and what was wrong with me flying to Malibu that I didn't notice that we weren't climbing like we should have, because the gear's still hanging out, okay? Cruise checklist. And I've got to say, as an examiner on the DPE, I see on a lot of private practical tests, particularly on the cross-country phase, that cruise checklist is often ignored. And it's run as a flow, but one of the most critical ones is, did you double check your DG with the compass? And some of the junk that I fly in, you know, we could sell that DG to Reno. It'd be great for roulette, the way it spins. Wow, look at that. Can certainly be great in keeping you on course. And I hate to say this for the applicants, but I have had applicants fail practical tests because they were off course because they failed in their cruise checklist to double check the DG against the compass. It had precessed enough that they were off course, and so, you know, to beyond the limits of our standards. You know, as you've got a limit of 3 miles either side of your course. If you haven't double checked it and you don't have a good sense of direction, and there are a lot of folks out there who are directionally challenged. This stuff could get you in trouble. So start on the emptier tank. And I taxi on the emptier tank. When I get ready to do my run-up, I switch to the fuller tank. This way, I guarantee that both systems, right and left, are both working. If I need to fuel pump, as I might in a Cherokee, when I turn that pump on, I listen before the engine starts, because that's the only time I can hear it running. Once the engine starts, I won't hear it. Okay. A lot of checklists say turn that pump off, and once you get into cruise, it might be at 8,500 feet. You've been climbing for a long time. You turn the pump off, the mechanical pump has failed. If you don't keep your finger on the electric pump, you just flip it off and forget about ever checking the pressure. The engine quits, and now and you go and do a beautiful forced landing on a highway, and nothing happens except you're really embarrassed. And this is a true story, because it happened not to me. I was in San Jose for AOPA doing a seminar, and a flight instructor and a client landed on a freeway in a Cherokee 180. They'd run out of gas. Miraculously, they didn't hit any cars. They were able to have enough momentum to taxi off into the grass. Created one hell of a traffic jam. It was on the news, and they were pretty exciting. You know how they got the airplane out of there?
Flew it out.
They switched tanks. Switched tanks, turned on the pump, started it, cleared a lane, flew it down. True story. Truth is stranger than fiction. Yep. So when I'm operating planes like that, I want to hear that the pump's working, and then I personally will turn the fuel pump off at 1,000 feet. My hand stays on the pump until I check fuel pressure. I've got fuel pressure, my hand comes off, and now I don't worry about it. If I turn the pump off, the engine, there's no fuel pressure, the pump goes right back on, the engine doesn't miss a beat, I just fly the pattern and land. Okay. Why do I wait until I'm up at 8,500 feet? Who knows how many miles away from the airport now? Perhaps if I'm headed off west out of Columbia County over to Catskills, where am I going to land if the engine quits? So, mistakes that I've seen, mistakes that I've made, mistakes that can happen. I also knew that when an engine quits, it quits for one of three reasons. It's not getting fuel, fire, or air. Restore what's missing, and it will run. I always, so often, I get a kick on practical tests when we go through a simulated engine failure, and the applicant will say, attempt to restart, and they reach over to the magneto switch. What's wrong with that? Prop's still turning. If we restore either fuel or air, spark, maybe it's associated with magneto switch. Maybe the magneto switch just fell out, but the magnetos, you know, they're still going to keep on ticking. Okay. Anyway, I knew the problem here, so immediately pump on or reached across some switch tanks. The engine caught. Photographer says, "Do we have a problem?" I said, "We're going back to Great Barrington right now. I hope you've got all your shots. And when we land, I don't know about you, but I'm going to find a good laundromat close by." If you find yourself in a nose-down attitude and the airspeed is increasing, as it's trending up, and as the case will be for a pilot last week in Long Island, the airplane came out of the sky in pieces. 3 people killed. Do you know about that accident? Did you hear about that accident in a Bonanza? What's the recovery?
Reduced power, level wings.
Reduce power, number one. Level the wings. Pull up, okay? Now it was interesting, because Jim put on this tape here, or a video or something. And I was watching part of it, and they were actually talking about recovery and critical lateral. And they didn't include the part that everyone has left out. Push. Silence.
Push
Do you
forward.
hear it? Do you hear the silence? It's far out. Why do we push?
Break the angle of attack.
Well, we want to keep the angle of attack where it is, okay? Now, what does trim do for an airplane? Simple question. Any examiner would ask you this on a practical test. What's the purpose of trim?
Reduce control pressures.
Reduce control pressures. I hear this all the time. That's true. But is that really what trim does? Huh? Have you heard my seminar before? No, you know. Yes, it sets the angle of attack, indeed. When we level off in cruise, yeah, we trim to get rid of the pressure, but we are establishing an angle of attack because we know control performance. Every combination of pitch, power, and configuration will yield some kind of performance. So in cruise, we're clean, gears up, flaps are up, power is set, and we get whatever it might be. In my Cardinal, it's 140 knots. And the trim will maintain that. Even if we're in a Cherokee 180 doing 110 miles an hour at 2,400 RPM, if you reduce the power to 2,000, are you paying attention back here, Austin? If you reduce your power, okay, so you're 20, what do you typically run for power in this in cruise? Just curious. 24. And what does it yield to you speed-wise? 100 miles an hour, okay. If you reduce the power to 2,000, what's the airplane going to do? Don't touch anything else. Just pull that throttle out to 2,000 RPM. What's the airplane going to do? Descend. Will it accelerate?
A little bit.
Very little bit. Basically, the trim is going to maintain the angle of attack. And an angle of attack has a byproduct called induced drag. Steady state flight, thrust equals drag. We've trimmed for it. We reduce the thrust, the drag is reduced, the nose drops. Do we accelerate? No, okay? But when we get in a spiral dive, we exceed trimmed speed because the wings are loading up in this steep bank. The surprise element. So how many of you practice this with your flight instructors? Probably everybody. At least once every other year, I would hope, if not more often. And when the instructor says to you, so you're flying along with them, and I turn, you're going to say, okay, you got the hood on, take your hands and feet off the controls, put your chin on your chest. I have the controls. You have the controls. All the while I'm manipulating the airplane, what are you, the pilot in training, doing as you sit in that left seat? Uh-huh. You're trying to figure out what I'm doing. And you have a lot of tools to use. You really do. You have your ears. You can hear speed developing. You can hear airflow over the cockpit. You can feel coordination, lack of coordination, loading, unloading. You can feel all of that. You can hear it. You're using all your senses. But when you get into a spiral dive that you yourself have created, you're not paying attention. I do this on a practical test. Very simply, I say, you have the controls. I have the controls. Keep the hood on. Keep the hood on? Yeah. And by the way, I want you to fly, whatever the heading is, whatever the altitude is, with your eyes closed. And when I tell you to open your eyes, but just look at the gauges. Invariably, they'll get into a spiral dive. Sometimes it only takes 3 or 4 seconds. Now, I'm not going to let it get all the way up to 10 knots short of V&E. I'm just not going to go there. I did once, and when I said to the applicant, you've got the controls, what did he do? Added power. We're up over V&E in a heartbeat. Okay, I'm here, and I knew how to deal with it. Boy, was I surprised. At any rate, they don't know what's going on. Most applicants or pilots in training don't know what's going on. And so when I say open your eyes, the immediate reaction, roll and pull, startle response, kills so many pilots. I sat on a committee, the loss control work group number 2, dealing with initial climb and en route, and looking at fatal accident after fatal accident after fatal accident for a year and a half. It was a very somber job. You wouldn't believe how many pilots died and their passengers losing control in IMC. These are instrument-rated pilots when they went partial panel, when a vacuum system failed or a pitot tube failed to heat and iced up. Quite often they come out of the clouds. Now, as soon as even if you recognize it, power off is the very first thing, but when it's a startle, most applicants and pilots in training forget about pulling the power off. They just roll and pull. But if you're already up well into the yellow arc, or perhaps even above V&E, the minute you roll the wings level, what's the airplane going to try to do? It's going to try to go back to 100 miles an hour, in the case of Austin's Cherokee. And typically it tears off pieces, parts. This is all supposition about the pilot in Long Island last week. But if I were there, I'm willing to bet that's exactly what happened. We can't, as instructors, train to this. We can't train to get to those kind of speeds. So it's only by you repeating to yourself over and over. If I lose control in a spiral dive, power off, push. Now you don't have to push to go negative and throw everything in the back up over your head, okay? Just enough so that the airplane doesn't zoom back up. Push, roll level, wait, let the speed bleed off, and now gently ease off the pressure that you're holding, allow it to start to climb and come back in with the power. So, a mistake that I see almost on a daily basis in practical tests and in doing IPCs and flight reviews.